In this short tutorial, we're going to look at what constitutes associated companies. Now, we know that associated companies must share the small business deduction limit of $500,000. We learned that back in chapter 12. So in this short tutorial, we're going to look at what constitutes associated companies or associated corporations. Now, in the Income Tax Act, on the next slide here, under ITA 256.1, there are 5 paragraphs that describe how corporations or companies could be associated. So let's look at the first of the 5 paragraphs, ITA 256.1a. Now, Company A owns more than 50% of the outstanding voting shares of Company B, and because Company A controls Company B, they are considered associated. So that's pretty simple. Let's move on to the next slide, ITA 256.1b. Now in this example, Ms. Smith controls Company A because she owns more than 50% of the voting shares. Ms. Smith also controls Company B because she owns more than 50% of the voting shares. And so by virtue that they're both controlled by the same person, Company A and Company B are associated. Moving on to the next slide, ITA 256.1c. Now in this example, Mrs. Smith and Mr. Smith, we're assuming that they're spouses. They're related to one another. So Mrs. Smith owns more than 50% of the voting shares of Company A, so she controls Company A. On the other end, Mr. Smith owns more than 50% of the voting shares of Company B, so he controls Company B. Now, in addition to that, there needs to be a cross ownership test met. Now, it can go in either direction. Mrs. Smith must also own not less than 25% of the voting shares of Company B, or Mr. Smith must own not less than 25% of the voting shares of Company A. That's the cross ownership test. So as long as one direction is met, then Company A and Company B are considered associated. Moving on to the next slide, ITA 256.1d. Now in this example, Mr. Go controls Company A because he owns more than 50% of the voting shares of Company A. Now when we go to the other end and look at Company B, that is controlled by a group. And that group consists of Mrs. Go, who is the spouse of Mr. Go, and also Mr. Go's brother. So this group, Mrs. Go and Mr. Go's brother, they control Company B because together they own more than 50% of the voting shares of Company B. Now, the allocation of how much each owns could vary. Mrs. Go could own, let's say, 5% of the shares of Company B, and Mr. Go's brother might own 46%. So together they own 51%, which would give them control. So as long as collectively they own more than 50%, they are a group that controls Company B. Now this group is also related to Mr. Go. Mr. Go is related to Mrs. Go. Mr. Go is also related to his brother. So he's related to each member of a group that controls Company B. Now, in addition to that, the cross ownership test must be met. And so in this example, as long as Mr. Go owns not less than 25% of Company B, then Company A and Company B are considered associated. So once again, that cross ownership test must be met in order for the companies to be considered associated. And moving on to the last slide, ITA 256.1e. Now, in this example, Company A is controlled by this couple, Mr. and Mrs. Brown. So Mr. and Mrs. Brown are a couple, they're a related group that control company A. Now, company B is controlled by Mr. Fortin, who is Mrs. Brown's brother, and his spouse, Mrs. Fortin. So together, they're a related group that control company B because they own more than 50%. Now, in this example, each member of the related group are related to one another. And so because of that, the cross-ownership test in this example, if either Mr. or Mrs. Brown own, let's say, once again, not less than 25% of company B, in this example 40%, then the two companies would be considered associated. So once again, each member of the related group is related to all members of the other related group. So Mr. and Mrs. Brown is a related group that control company B. Mr. and Mrs. Fortin is a related group that controls company B. And each member of the group that controls A and also that controls B, they're also related to one another. So in this example, because the related group members are related to one another and the cross-ownership test is met, either Mr. or Mrs. Brown own not less than 25% of the voting shares of company B, then company A and company B are considered associated. So that brings us to the end of this short tutorial with respect to associated companies.